Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of the Reason Roundtable where we answer even more of your questions. This is not a full-sized roundtable. It's just a table for two. I'm your host, Peter Suderman, and today I am joined by my illustrious colleague, Eric Boehm, Reason's Master of Trade Policy. Happy Thursday, Eric.
Happy Thursday, Peter.
All right. So on this week's episode of Table for Two, we're going to talk about libertarians and tariffs. We don't like them, but specifically the question is whether libertarians should appreciate tariffs, at least in some cases, because they bring in tax revenue that might be able to help close the budget deficit. This question comes from Simon, who writes, "Today I read a New York Times article about how Trump's tariffs are going to be hard to quit. As free markets and free trade guy, I've been consistently against his tariffs, good job, and in favor of free trade agreements, but I'm also stridently a deficit hawk, also good job, and I am horrified at the government's inability to address runaway spending and the resulting debt levels. It is painfully obvious that Congress won't rein in spending. Yes, it is. Reducing debt is not the realm of the executive. Yet, we clearly need to take some kind of corrective action, if only to show international markets that we will have to address our debt. So, what if the revenues from tariffs were explicitly used to pay down the debt? In this admittedly fantastical scenario, I, as a fiscal hawk, would be less opposed to the concept of tariffs, which seem to have a degree of practicality about them, at least since everyone ends up paying, as well as some bipartisan support. So, Eric, you and I both are horrified by the federal debt. We also don't love tariffs. Why do you not like them?
Yeah, I think before we get to the fiscal stuff and the question of raising revenue, which is an interesting one, and I know we will get there, I think it's also interesting to note something that the questioner said in the email there, which is like that Trump's tariffs will be hard to quit. And I think this is something at least that I'm thinking about a lot right now, and something that I'm writing about in a piece that'll be out sometime in the near future, maybe out by the time you're seeing this actually, is about how tariffs tend to be really sticky. And the best example of this is probably the so-called chicken tax. Now, Peter, you know about the chicken tax, right? Everybody knows about the chicken tax. Now,
I do not know about the chicken tax. Tell me.
The chicken tax is a tariff on imported light trucks, basically pickup trucks, and also some passenger vans that we bring in. 15% tariff. It's been in place since the 1960s. So why is it called the chicken tax? Well, in the 1960s, Europe got real grumpy about America exporting chicken. They didn't want our chicken over there. There's a lot of chicken farmers in Europe. They have some political clout for reasons, European reasons, that we can't comprehend as Americans. The chicken farmers went to the powers that be in Europe at the time, the sort of early form of the EU, and they got a tariff on American chicken. And in response to this sparked a sort of little brief trade war between the U.S. and Europe. In response to this, President Lyndon Johnson put this 15% tax on imported light trucks, which was mostly meant to target Volkswagen at the time, right? The Volkswagen vans and other things that were being imported in the 1960s. And it worked. It more or less cut off the import of foreign light trucks, pickup trucks and vans and things like this. That trade war ended a long time ago. Most of the other tariffs connected to that trade war went off the books when the war ended. Everybody, the tariff on chicken went away. All the other stuff went away. That tariff on light trucks never went away. It's still with us today. We still pay a 15% tariff if you import a truck from overseas. And this warps the market in all sorts of ways that people don't even necessarily notice, but it's one of the reasons why American pickup trucks are so expensive. It's one of the reasons why they're much more expensive than, even a large SUV or something like that. And it's because there's this added cost, and so domestic automakers raise their prices because they can, because there's not as much competition. And just sort of like the weird little side effect of this is that the Toyota Hilux, which is actually the most popular pickup truck in the world. You've never seen one in the United States because they don't sell it in the United States. It's basically the Toyota Tacoma, which they make here, but it's a little bit different. Very popular globally, but you can't buy it in the United States. So anyway, this tariff has been with us for much, 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 much longer than the original justification for putting it in place, right? It was very sticky. And that tends to be the case. We still have high tariffs on shoes and textiles, things where there hasn't really been a domestic domestic production of those products in this country in any sort of large scale that had any sort of political clout for decades. And yet these tariffs that were implemented back in the 1930s and even earlier are just still on the books because once they're there, they basically never go away. And so I've been thinking about this question a lot of like, what happens now that we've reached this point? We've gotten to August. We've now got more or less the president's, everything is always subject to change, but we sort of see where this is going. There's going to be 15% global baseline tariff and then higher tariffs on certain countries. And I think a lot of that might turn out to be quite sticky if it isn't either struck down by the courts, which is a definite possibility, or pushed back on by Congress in some meaningful way within, say, the first year that it's on the books. Because then, and we can talk about the fiscal policy side of it then, once it's there for a year, I think it becomes very difficult to take away that revenue.
So what you're saying is Trump's tariffs on everybody become the chicken tax, but for everything.
Yeah, sort of. And so tariffs are sticky. I guess I should say there's really sort of two arguments for why tariffs are sticky. One is that there are oftentimes, in the case of the chicken tax, there are domestic industries that like it, right? The domestic auto industry, domestic pickup truck making industry specifically, likes the fact that they have less competition because of this 15% tariff. And so that's one of the reasons why it's never been taken off, because there's just a little political constituency that benefits from it. It's the famous, concentrated benefits and diffuse costs argument. And that's why that stays on the books. I think when you look at the Trump tariffs broadly, what you see is exactly the point that the questioner raises in this email, which is there's going to be a lot of revenue that comes in. Not as much as the Trump administration is saying. It's not $700 billion a year like Howard Lutnick has been talking about. The best estimates are like somewhere in the $200 billion range. That's what the Tax Foundation and the Yale Budget Lab have both guessed, somewhere in that range. But once that's there, once you have a year of that revenue coming in, any attempt by Congress or by a future administration to take those tariffs off is going to add to the deficit. It's going to look like it adds to the deficit. I mean, it will add to the deficit because you'll be removing a stream of revenue in the same way that a tax cut removes revenue and adds to the deficit, because it will be that. It will be a tax cut because you'll be eliminating a tax on imports. And so I think that becomes politically difficult to do when you're in a situation like we're in right now, where you're running $2 trillion deficits in perpetuity going forward. There will be people, including maybe even us, who would sit there and say, well, if you're going to take $200 billion out, you got to have an offset somewhere. You got to cut spending somewhere. And that's obviously what should be done. But it just adds to the political difficulty of removing these tariffs once they're in place and once the money is coming in. And that's a situation that we're going to have to confront if they are actually here to stay.
Okay, but let's go back to the deficit part, because this is an argument that the president has been making himself, right? He has said for years, since his first campaign, I'm going to solve the deficit. I'm going to solve debts. And there's not going to be a debt and deficits any longer, at least not an annual deficit. And the reason is because of tariffs. Is that argument a good one if the tariffs are, in fact, going to bring in several $100 billion a year?
The tariffs can help us close the deficit a little bit by, a few $100 billion a year, although it doesn't even, there may actually be more consequences because of there may be economic consequences as a result of the tariffs that actually end up making the deficit bigger, or end up basically canceling out that money, because the people who, again, at like the Yale Budget Lab and the Tax Foundation and other institutions like this, they look at not just the tax revenue that comes in as a result of the tariffs, but also what they call the dynamic effects of that. So that means the downstream economic consequences. And if you end up reducing economic growth, if you end up employing fewer people, if you end up having a hit, having lower GDP in the future as a result of the tariffs, then that's obviously going to have a knock-on effect to how much tax revenue you generate. I will say that there is the tiniest, narrowest argument in favor of tariffs that I'm willing to accept is that if we were doing tariffs in some sort of way that was part of an overall plan to grapple with that $2 trillion annual deficit that we have going forward. And that means, dealing with the things that are actually driving that deficit, which are Social Security and Medicare overwhelmingly. And if we were also cutting spending, and if the president was putting forward a plan to actually, as he's claimed he wants to do, balance the budget, and tariffs were part of that mix, and we could see that the math, checked out to the extent that you can, forecast these things, then like, okay, maybe there's an argument there that I'd be willing to accept. Maybe there is some sort of consumption tax, tariff, something that's part of that solution to get us into a place where our budget deficit is at least more manageable or more sane. That's not what we're seeing from the administration. We're hearing a lot of talk on one hand about reducing the deficit or balancing the budget. And on the other hand, we're seeing a real haphazard tariff policy that doesn't appear to be attached to any actual budget plan in any sort of like serious way.
So what you're saying is that tariffs are taxes, and like all taxes, tariffs have negative effects on the economy, right? They don't just raise money; they also cause people to change their behavior in ways that affect the economy, right? And tariffs are a particularly destructive form of tax. They're not even the best form or the ideal form of tax if you are going to raise money through the tax system, right? And so when you account for all of the ripple effects that tariffs are going to have on the economy, you might not even end up raising all that much money, certainly compared with other types of taxes. But like, so if you are thinking about this as a tool for addressing the deficit, part of what you want to do when to address the deficit is to increase economic activity, to make the economy stronger. Right? A stronger economy is going to throw off more revenue and just kind of solve a lot of your budgetary problems. Tariffs make the economy weaker. They make every household poorer. They make it harder, especially with the uncertainty factor, because it's not just that we have tariffs here. It's that with Trump in charge, we also have a situation in which you don't know what the tariffs are even going to be, which means you can't plan ahead, which means that the economy is going to struggle. And a weaker economy, even if it is bringing in some amount of tax revenue through these tariffs, that weaker economy is not going to be one in which we close the deficit or in which it is somehow or another easier to reduce the debt.
In every conversation I've had with like a business owner, an entrepreneur going back several months now for a number of pieces that I've written for Reason, it comes up over and over again that, well, the uncertainty or the cost of the tariffs means that I'm going to have to put off some investment that I wanted. We're not going to build an expansion on a factory that we planned. I'm not going to hire as many people as I otherwise would have intended to. And it's not just like those little conversations that I'm having. It's conversations that lots of other reporters have been having and reporting out in, at CNBC and the Wall Street Journal and all sorts of places like that for months now. This is the same data that like the Federal Reserve pulls together once a quarter in its so-called beige book, which is just like a big summary of like what is it that executives and corporate types are thinking right now about the economy. And you've just seen this same sort of thing repeated over and over again for the last few months in those reports, earnings calls and stuff like this too. It's also been a lot of talk about the way tariffs are going to reduce investment and reduce hiring. And now we're starting to see that in, the jobs data has come out that's been, obviously a little bit disappointing for the last couple of months. The president is obviously quite disappointed about this. And I think that is the jobs data specifically, last week's like fight over that and the fact that the BLS director got fired, shows that Trump is now keenly aware of the fact that this tariff policy actually has trade-offs, right? There's actually a consequence here. It's not just that you get a whole bunch of new money into the Treasury, which is what he and Howard Lutnick keep talking about, all this new money that's flowing in, how the country is going to be wealthier than ever. Well, like, okay, if you raise taxes by a bunch, if you suddenly jacked up the corporate income tax rate, you'd also get a bunch of new money flowing into the Treasury, but you would get all these negative consequences too. You would have less investment, you would have fewer jobs, you would have slower growth over the long term, and that's going to ultimately reduce in the long run how much tax revenue you bring in, and it's going to have a whole bunch of other negative consequences too, because people are going to lose their jobs, or they're not going to make as much, or they're not going to be able to buy as much, and that gets totally lost. But now they can't dismiss those trade-offs anymore because that's starting to show up in the actual economic data. And I fear that we're going to see more of that now that we've got, not just the baseline 10% tariffs that he set in April, but we've now got these, August 1st tariffs that are set to go into effect this week. I guess we should also just say as a caveat here that who knows, the whole thing could be canceled by Thursday by the time people are listening to this, because that's what happened in April. It was, we're definitely putting these tariffs in place. place. We're definitely doing this. There's not any way around it. There's not going to be any delays. There's not going to be any cancellations. And then the day before they were meant to go actually into effect, the White House said, oh, wait, actually, we're going to hold off for a few months because we don't like the signals that we're getting from the economy. And that could very well happen again. I certainly hope that it does happen again, because that would be, even though that would create more uncertainty, it would be better, I think, than the alternative where we have this world of significantly higher tariffs, the highest tariffs that this country has seen in well over 100 years.
Turns out uncertainty makes it hard to do a podcast as well as to run a business. There are always trade-offs. There are always unintended consequences. Tariffs are no different. All right, thanks so much for watching Table for Two. For more bonus segments like this one, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check back regularly. If you'd like us to answer your question, send your short, succinct, pithy, and not very long question to podcast@reason.com. That's podcast@reason.com. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you soon.